nation's most watched morning programs. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how personal agendas can turn a simple conversation into a career-defining moment. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're going to want to discuss this one with fellow viewers. The Good Morning America studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy. Makeup artists applied final touches, producers scurried between monitors, and the familiar hum of live television preparation filled the air. Dwayne Johnson, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that perfectly complemented his imposing frame, sat comfortably in the interview chair, flashing that trademark smile that had endeared him to millions worldwide. He had done this dance countless times before, promoting his latest film across the morning show circuit with the practiced ease of a seasoned professional. George Stephanopoulos, looking sharp in his navy blazer and matching tie, shuffled through his notes one final time. The veteran journalist's expression appeared neutral, professional even, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this interview might venture beyond the typical promotional fare. As the floor manager counted down from 10, both men straightened in their chairs, cameras locked into position, and the red recording light illuminated. "Good morning. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're here with Dwayne Johnson, better known to millions as The Rock," George began, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone that had made him a household name in journalism. "Dwayne, thanks for joining us this morning." "Always a pleasure, George." "Thanks for having me," Dwayne replied, his voice warm and genuine, completely unaware of the direction this conversation was about to take. "So let's talk about your new film. Action-packed, big budget, the kind of spectacle audiences have come to expect from you. But I want to dig a little deeper today," George said, leaning forward slightly, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "You've built this incredible brand around being the people's champion, this everyman who rose from humble beginnings. But some critics are saying that image might be more carefully crafted than authentic." Dwayne's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible shift that anyone who wasn't looking closely might have missed. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, George. My story is my story. I've never been anything but honest about where I come from and the journey that brought me here." "Well, let's examine that journey," George pressed, consulting his notes with theatrical precision. "Your father was a professional wrestler. You attended the University of Miami on a football scholarship. You had connections in the entertainment industry through your family's wrestling legacy. Some might say your humble beginnings narrative conveniently omits some significant advantages you had along the way." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Dwayne's posture straightened, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "George, I think you're mischaracterizing my background. Yes, my father wrestled, but that doesn't mean I had a silver spoon in my mouth. We struggled financially, we moved constantly, and I had to earn everything I achieved through hard work and determination. But you can't deny that having a father in the wrestling business gave you access and opportunities that other aspiring entertainers simply don't have," George countered, his tone becoming more prosecutorial with each word. "Isn't it a bit disingenuous to present yourself as this underdog, when you essentially had industry connections from birth?" Dwayne's famous composure was beginning to crack, though he maintained his professional demeanor. "What I can't deny is that I've always been grateful for any opportunities that came my way, but I've never taken anything for granted. I've worked my tail off for everything I've achieved, and I've tried to use whatever platform I've been given to inspire and help others." "Help others," George repeated, his voice taking on a sardonic edge. "Let's talk about that. Your social media presence is carefully curated to show this motivational, inspirational figure, but behind the scenes, industry insiders tell a different story. They describe someone who's calculating, controlling, demanding specific script changes, dictating how other actors can appear in scenes with you. Is the real Dwayne Johnson as generous and collaborative as the public persona suggests?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. Dwayne's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, now gripped them slightly tighter. His voice, when he spoke, carried a warning that anyone familiar with his wrestling persona would recognize. "George, I'm going to need you to be very careful about the accusations you're making here. I've worked with hundreds of people in this industry, and I pride myself on being professional and respectful to everyone on every set. But that's not what some of your co-stars have said in private conversations, George continued, clearly relishing the discomfort he was creating. Sources close to several major productions have described you as someone who's more interested in protecting your image than creating great entertainment. They say you've become so brand-conscious that you've lost touch with the authenticity that originally made you appealing. Sources, Dwayne said, the word dripping with disdain. Anonymous sources making vague accusations. That's the kind of journalism you're proud of, George? Because I remember when you actually reported facts instead of gossip and innuendo. George's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had drawn blood, and they both knew it. I'm simply asking the questions that many people are thinking. Your meteoric rise in Hollywood has been unprecedented, but some industry observers wonder if it's sustainable when it's built on such a carefully manufactured image. Manufactured, Dwayne repeated slowly, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. You know what's manufactured, George? This interview. This ambush. You invited me here to talk about my film, and instead you're sitting there trying to tear down everything I've worked for based on unnamed sources and gossip. The studio had gone remarkably quiet. Camera operators exchanged glances, producers whispered urgently into their headsets, and the usual bustling energy of live television had been replaced by a tension so thick it was almost visible. George, however, seemed energized by the conflict he had created. Let's talk about your business practices, George continued, completely ignoring the warning signs that were becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the studio except himself. Your production company has been involved in several projects where you've negotiated unprecedented creative control. Some executives have privately expressed frustration with what they call your inflexibility and ego-driven demands. Dwayne's laugh was sharp and humorless. Ego-driven demands. That's rich coming from someone who's built an entire career on the back of his political connections and then lectures others about authenticity. At least I earned my position through entertaining people instead of riding coattails. The personal nature of Dwayne's response clearly caught George off guard. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with the determination of a man who had already crossed the point of no return. That's an interesting deflection, but we're not here to talk about my career. We're here to examine whether the Dwayne Johnson brand has become more important to you than honest storytelling or genuine human connection. You want to talk about honest storytelling? Dwayne said, his voice rising slightly for the first time since the interview began. How about we start with honest journalism? How about you tell your viewers that this entire line of questioning came from a hit piece that's been shopped around Hollywood for months by people with their own agendas? How about you mention that every single one of these anonymous sources has been debunked by people who actually worked with me and were willing to put their names on the record? George's confidence wavered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. I'm asking legitimate questions about a public figure who has significant influence over popular culture. Your reaction suggests that maybe there's more truth to these concerns than you're willing to admit. My reaction, Dwayne said slowly, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, is the reaction of someone who came here in good faith to promote a film that employed hundreds of hardworking people, only to find himself being ambushed by a journalist who's apparently more interested in generating controversy than conducting an actual interview. I'm conducting the kind of interview that holds powerful people accountable, George shot back, his own composure beginning to slip. You've become one of the most influential figures in entertainment, and with that comes scrutiny. If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you're not as ready for that level of responsibility as you claim to be. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Dwayne stared at George for a long moment, and those familiar with his wrestling career could practically see the mental shift from entertainer to competitor. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled intensity that had made him a champion in the ring. Let me tell you something about responsibility, George. I take responsibility for every word that comes out of my mouth, every project I attach my name to, and every person whose livelihood depends on the success of the work we do together. What I don't take responsibility for are the fabricated narratives created by people who have never stepped foot on a film set, never employed a single person in this industry, and never put themselves on the line to create something that brings joy to millions of people around the world. But you do take responsibility for the way you've changed since becoming successful. George pressed, clearly hoping to land a decisive blow. Multiple sources describe someone who's become increasingly isolated, surrounded by yes men, out of touch with the regular people you claim to represent. Multiple sources, Dwayne repeated, shaking his head with disgust. You keep saying that like it means something. You know what I call multiple anonymous sources? Cowards. People who don't have the backbone to say something to my face or put their name behind their accusations. If someone has a problem with how I conduct myself, I'm not hard to find. My phone number hasn't changed in 10 years, my email is the same, and I'm on set or in the gym at the same times every day. But instead of having an honest conversation, they whisper to gossip columnists and washed-up journalists looking for their next ratings grab. The insult hit its mark, and George's professional mask finally slipped completely. Washed up? I've been reporting the news since before you were body-slamming people for the entertainment of drunk college kids. Don't lecture me about journalism while you're sitting there proving every point about your ego and your inability to handle criticism. Criticism? Dwayne stood up from his chair, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the desk. Is that what you call this character assassination, based on gossip and hearsay? Because where I come from, criticism involves facts, evidence, and the courage to make accusations with your name attached. What you're doing here isn't journalism, it's a hit job, and frankly, it's beneath both of us. George also stood, though his 5'7" frame looked almost comical next to Dwayne's massive presence. Sit down and finish the interview like a professional. You agreed to come on this show, and running away when the questions get tough only proves that everything I've been saying is true. Running away? Dwayne's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several crew members take an involuntary step backward. I've never run away from anything in my life. I've faced down professional athletes twice my size. I've performed in front of hostile crowds that wanted nothing more than to see me fail. And I've built a career by never backing down from a challenge. But I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and let some has-been journalists trash my reputation on live television based on nothing but anonymous gossip and personal vendetta. Personal vendetta? George's voice rose to match Dwayne's intensity. This is about accountability. This is about asking the hard questions that other interviewers are too starstruck or too scared to ask. Someone needs to examine whether the most powerful man in Hollywood is actually the person he pretends to be. The person I pretend to be? Dwayne's composure finally cracked completely. I wake up at 4:30 every morning and work out before most people are awake because I want to be the best version of myself for everyone who counts on me. I spend my weekends visiting children's hospitals and military bases because I believe in giving back. I've employed thousands of people and helped launch the careers of dozens of actors, writers, and directors who might never have gotten a chance otherwise. But sure, George, let's focus on some anonymous sources who probably couldn't get hired on one of my projects because they weren't good enough. The studio had descended into complete chaos. Producers were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, camera operators were unsure whether to keep rolling, and the usual controlled environment of live television had devolved into something resembling a street fight. But George, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline, pressed forward with the relentless determination of a man who had already burned all his bridges. And there it is, George said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. The real Dwayne Johnson. Not the motivational speaker, not the people's champion, but the ego-driven celebrity who thinks his success gives him the right to dismiss anyone who dares to question him. This is exactly what my sources were talking about. The moment those words left George's mouth, something shifted in Dwayne's demeanor. The anger that had been building throughout the interview suddenly crystallized into something colder, more calculating. When he spoke, his voice was eerily calm, the kind of quiet that experienced fighters recognize as far more dangerous than shouting. You know what, George? You're absolutely right. This is the real me. The real me doesn't suffer fools gladly. The real me doesn't pretend that gossip is journalism. And the real me knows when someone is trying to use my name and my reputation to salvage their own failing career. Dwayne reached up and unclipped his microphone with deliberate precision. The real me also knows when an interview is over. You can't just walk away, George said, desperation creeping into his voice, as he realized his ambush was backfiring spectacularly. This is live television. You have contractual obligations. You agreed to a full segment. My contractual obligation was for an interview, not a character assassination, Dwayne replied, dropping his microphone onto the chair with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the silent studio. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your accountability to your viewers. Did you tell them this was going to be a hit piece? Did you mention that you've been shopping this story to tabloids for weeks trying to find someone desperate enough to run with unsubstantiated rumors? George's face went pale. Those are serious accusations you're making without any proof. Anonymous sources, George, Dwayne said with a cold smile. Multiple sources close to the situation. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The difference is, my sources actually exist, and they're willing to go on the record. Would you like me to call them right now? The producer's voice could be heard frantically whispering through George's earpiece, but he seemed unable to hear anything beyond the sound of his own career imploding. You're making a huge mistake. Walking off this show will only confirm everything people are saying about you. What people, George? Your anonymous sources? Your unnamed industry insiders? Dwayne stepped closer to the desk, his presence now completely dominating the space. Or are you talking about the viewers who are watching you right now and seeing exactly what kind of journalist you really are? The kind who ambushes guests, the kind who deals in gossip instead of facts, the kind who thinks destroying someone's reputation is a legitimate interview technique? I'm asking the questions that need to be asked, George said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. Someone needs to hold you accountable. Hold me accountable for what exactly? Dwayne's voice rose again, but this time it carried the weight of genuine moral outrage. For working harder than anyone in my industry? For treating every person on my sets with respect and dignity? For using my platform to inspire people instead of tearing them down? If that's what you want to hold me accountable for, then I'm guilty as charged. For lying to the public about who you really are. George shot back, making one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. The accusation hung in the air for a moment before Dwayne laughed. But it wasn't the warm, infectious laugh that audiences had come to love. This laugh was sharp, bitter, and completely devoid of humor. Lying to the public. That's rich coming from someone who just spent 15 minutes presenting gossip as journalism and personal attacks as legitimate questions. You want to know who I really am? I'm someone who just wasted 15 minutes of my life trying to have a conversation with a man who stopped being a journalist years ago and became a tabloid hack. George's composure completely crumbled. How dare you? I've been reporting the news for over 3 decades. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners. I don't need to justify my credentials to some steroid-enhanced wrestler who got lucky in Hollywood. The personal attack was a bridge too far, and everyone in the studio knew it. The camera operators stopped pretending to film, the producers stopped whispering into their headsets, and even the makeup artists and assistants stopped their bustling to witness what was about to happen. Dwayne stood perfectly still for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. Steroid-enhanced wrestler who got lucky. He nodded slowly, as if considering the words carefully. You know what, George? Thank you. Thank you for finally showing everyone who you really are. Thank you for proving that when you strip away the fancy desk and the network credentials and the illusion of respectability, you're just another bitter, jealous, small-minded person who can't stand to see someone else succeed. I am not jealous of you, George sputtered, his face now red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. No. Dwayne tilted his head slightly. Then explain this interview. Explain why you invited me here under false pretenses just to attack my character. Explain why you're so invested in tearing down someone who's never done anything to you personally. Explain why you're willing to destroy your own credibility just to try to damage mine. George opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before Dwayne continued. I'll tell you what I think happened here. I think you looked at my success and saw everything you never achieved. I think you saw someone who built something positive and meaningful. And it reminded you of how much negativity and destruction you've contributed to the world. I think you're angry that a steroid-enhanced wrestler, as you so eloquently put it, has more respect and influence than a man who's spent his entire career pretending to be important. That's enough, George said weakly, but his protest carried no authority. No, George, it's not nearly enough. Because you're not just attacking me here. You're attacking every person who believed in themselves enough to chase an impossible dream. You're attacking every kid who's been told they're not smart enough, or connected enough, or sophisticated enough to make something of themselves. You're attacking the very idea that hard work and determination and treating people with respect can actually mean something in this world. Dwayne straightened his jacket and looked directly into the camera that was still rolling despite the chaos around them. To everyone watching this at home, I want you to remember something. There will always be people like George Stephanopoulos in your life. People who are so threatened by your success that they'll try to tear you down with lies and gossip and personal attacks. But you don't have to sit there and take it. You don't have to smile and nod while someone tries to destroy everything you've worked for. You have the right to stand up, speak your truth, and walk away from people who don't deserve your time or your energy. He turned back to George, who was now slumped in his chair looking like a man who had just watched his own public execution. As for you, George, I hope this was worth it. I hope those ratings you were chasing and that relevance you were desperately trying to reclaim was worth destroying whatever credibility you had left. Because this interview isn't going to hurt me. My fans know who I am, my colleagues know what I stand for, and my family knows what's in my heart. But everyone who watched this today now knows exactly who you are too. With that, Dwayne Johnson turned and walked toward the studio exit, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The cameras followed him as he moved through the maze of equipment and crew members, all of whom seemed frozen in place by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Just before he reached the door, he paused and looked back one final time. "Oh, and George," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the silent studio. "Next time you want to interview the real me, try asking real questions instead of hiding behind anonymous sources and personal vendettas. You might be surprised by what you learn." The studio door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo with the finality of a career-ending moment. George Stephanopoulos sat alone at his desk, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been intended as a routine morning show interview, staring at the door through which one of Hollywood's biggest stars had just walked out of his professional life forever. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing the stunned silence and George's shell-shocked expression before someone finally remembered to cut to commercial. But the damage was already done, and everyone in that studio